Hello, I'm Jerry Stewart, and depending on whether you're seeing this a few days before Thanksgiving or on Thanksgiving Day, happy Thanksgiving. It was about 15 years ago that I read the first-hand account of what happened at that first Thanksgiving all those years ago, almost 400 years ago, believe it or not. And the story of these simple people that we know as the Pilgrims. So let me take a few moments and tell you the story. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a way that you can get a manuscript copy of the story. And I have a great idea for something you can do with your family just before you eat your Thanksgiving meal. Back in the early 1600s, there was a lot of countries that were rushing to try to get people to settle in America. They'd been told that there was riches and such and such and such. Well, wasn't so successful. One of the colonies that we're familiar with was a colony named Jamestown, and they came in the early 1600s. But what most people don't know is a large majority of the people at Jamestown did not survive. There were numerous efforts to settle in America. And for many, just getting across the Atlantic, so many who tried to get across actually died before they even got there. Well, there was a group of people that were very religious-minded, and they really didn't agree with the way the churches were operating in England. And so they decided to start their own churches. And when they did, the people in England didn't like that. And they called them separatists because they were separated from the rest of the church. They eventually drove them out of England, drove them to Holland, and they just couldn't make it there. There wasn't enough work, and they didn't speak the language. And they had been really, really believing that they wanted to go to America. They knew that it maybe in some ways was a crazy idea, but they just kept praying and asking, Lord, do you want us to go to America? And finally, after praying faithfully for quite a long time, they believed with all their heart that God was sending them to America. But what they did was they decided to do something a little different. They decided before they left to give it to the Lord and to say, Lord, thy will be done. Now that kind of sounds like, wow, is that a good plan? Well, for a lot of people, trusting in the Lord is their best plan. I can tell you myself, I've had numerous times in my life when I would say, I'm going to trust in the Lord. And God has been faithful. Well, they got on the ship. First thing that happened was one of the ships sprung a leak. It was a ship called the Speedwell, and they had to go back. Now, they had put aside a pretty good amount of food that they would eat as they traveled across the Atlantic, and then they would have enough left over to see them through the winter when they arrived in America. Well, when they had to go back and start over, and then they ended up with a ship called the Mayflower, they began to eat a lot of their food. And then heavy storms and various problems caused their ship to take a long time to get across the ocean. By the time they got there, they were going to the area that was close to Jamestown, where the settlers had been there. But when they tried to anchor, a powerful storm drove them north and just kept driving their ship further and further north until finally the winds subsided and they were way far north, very close to an area we know today as Cape Cod. And they were able to make it on shore, but they had to wade in the very cold water to get to shore. Well, when they got there, they discovered that actually the place where they had actually landed was better than the place that they had wanted to land. At this new area there in Cape Cod, there was lots of fresh water, there was good fertile soil, and interestingly enough, there were no marauding Indians. A lot of the Indians had gotten really upset with the explorers because they were coming and taking advantage of the Indians. And many times when people would land on the coast, they would be attacked. Well, the Pilgrims were really surprised that they had no Indian attack. So they began to settle in, but their problem was it had taken them so long to get there that by now the winter was setting in. It was an extremely harsh winter. So they did their best, but the lack of food, the icy weather, the fact that they had no shelters, they just couldn't make it work. And there was 102 men, women, and children, and they began to get sick. Consumption, pneumonia, just general weakness, tired, cold, all those things. And unfortunately, they began to die. And for a time there were people dying almost every day. Until finally, 47 of the 102 pilgrims had died there. Well, the thing that's interesting about the Pilgrims is that they did not lose hope. They did not complain. A number of them had diaries that they wrote down their daily activities. There's no written accounts of them getting angry and frustrated or quitting or wanting to give up. Instead, they just kept being thankful. Well, they didn't know how long they were going to last. And then enters a second new character in the story. It was an Indian. His name was Squanto. Now think about this story. Squanto had been a young boy at a tribe there very close to where the Pilgrims had landed. And they had not had a good result with the explorers. And the Indians got really tired of seeing them show up. And so from that point forward, every time that someone would show up, the Indian marauders would come and many times kill them all. Well, the Pilgrims had landed there, but they had seen no Indians. Well, this Indian that came into their camp, his name was Squanto, and he was part of that Pawtuxet Indian tribe. Well, at first, when they saw him come into the camp, they were very afraid because they wondered if he was a scout for a group of Indians that were going to come and kill them all. But instead, he told them an amazing story. He said when he was a young boy, he had been captured by some explorers. What they were doing was they were taking these young Indian boys back to England, and they were teaching them English, and they were preparing them to be guides for the explorers that were coming to our nation. So they captured him, took him against his will, and once they got him there, they could not see if he was going to be of any real advantage. So they decided they were going to put him up and sell him on the slave block. Well, interestingly enough, a group of missionaries that were there, they put their money together and they actually purchased the right for Squanto. And as soon as they sort of, I guess you would say, bought the right, they set him free. And then they asked him if he wanted to come and live in their monastery and be safe and be fed. And he came and he lived with them, and they taught him how to speak English, and they taught him about the Bible. They talked to him about God, about Jesus Christ, and he learned the Christian ways. And everything that I can read tells me that Squanto became a Christian believer. Well, time had gone on, a few years had gone by, and he had never gone back home. So he asked if he could go back home. And there was a ship that was traveling back to the area, and they gave him a ride back. Well, when he got back to the place where he had been captured, he was so excited to go and reunite with the tribe, his tribe. But when he got there, it was just a couple of months before the Pilgrims came. And when he got to his tribe, to his horror and shock, there was nothing there but bones. There had been some sort of an illness that had come through their tribe, and they had all died. And here he is. He'd been gone. He comes back, and now his mother, his father, his brothers, sisters, all of his family, all of the people in his tribe, they were all dead. And he didn't know what he was going to do. He thought to himself, why do I want to even live? I don't have a purpose. What am I going to do? Well, interestingly enough, that is when he met the Pilgrims. And he saw them, that they didn't really know the ways of the wild, that they didn't understand about how to take care of themselves in the wild there. And he thought to himself, maybe this is why I was kept alive, so that I could help these folks. And so with his help, they survived the winter. Well, the story goes on, and it's quite a wonderful story. The next spring and summer came, and as it turned, the Pilgrims had a very, very, very good crop. But something happened. Another ship full of Pilgrims came, and they had thought that they had enough food to last through the winter, but now when the new Pilgrims came, guess what? They didn't bring any food. They didn't bring any tools or such. They just came. They thought that they would just come. Everybody was so excited that they had come. But now there was more people than there was food. What would they do? Well, they decided they were going to have to ration their food. And they squeezed their food down so tight that, believe it or not, for a while there, their ration was 5 kernels of corn per day. Just 5 kernels of corn. Can you imagine a person trying to survive on just 5 kernels of corn? Well, fortunately, another ship came to the area, and they didn't have any extra food, but they had trinkets and other things that could be traded with the Indians. And so the Pilgrims got some of these items, and they traded for the food, and they survived. And all of them, the next summer, as they worked hard, they had a tremendous crop. The crop was so good that they decided to have, like a big party. And they put together everything that they had, and they contacted Squanto, and they said, Squanto, bring your friends, bring your family, bring everybody here. And of course, he had been trying to reconnect with another tribe, and he had, and he brought with him 120 braves, and they were kind of surprised when they saw all these people show up. But they had a great, great time. In fact, the party, this first Thanksgiving celebration, was so wonderful that it lasted for 3 full days. And you know what? They didn't have any football, they didn't have any TV, but they didn't care because they had a wonderful time. Now, we wonder why we still remember the Pilgrims, and I'll tell you the reason why. Our founding fathers were close enough in a time span to have been able to have heard the Pilgrim story second or third hand, and the story was amazing. that these people had trusted God and they had not given up, they had not quit, they had not laid down and felt sorry for themselves, and most of all, they had determined that no matter what, they were going to be thankful. You know, in our world today, in our country today, we desperately need for our children to have hope, to be able to see that there's a way for everything to work out, but that it starts with a thankful heart, a thankful spirit. And so I'm going to suggest this. You could take a hand at telling this story to your family. You could even show them this video if you'd like. But if you'd like to, I have quite a number of my followers who I make available to them a manuscript. And it's like about 2 pages long. And it talks specifically about the 5 kernels of corn and about the rationing. And I've had so many people that have said to me, you know what, Jerry, I got your manuscript and I read the story. And then just before we had our big Thanksgiving meal, I brought out little dishes with 5 kernels of corn to remind us all how very fortunate that we are. So if you'd love to continue to get my stories, subscribe now. But I would really like, below at the bottom of this talk here, I'm going to show you a link where you can go and get the manuscript. Don't forget to go and get that can of corn. And don't forget with the children to tell them the story about hope and assurance and thankfulness. And don't forget to thank Almighty God for being so kind and generous to us and so faithful. Happy Thanksgiving to you all. God bless you. Jerry Stewart saying, see you next time.